The iron collar arrived at the stone homestead on a Tuesday morning, packed in burlap and tied with a note from the territorial magistrate that read simply, "Your war bride. Treat her accordingly." Aaron Stone stood on the weathered porch of his log cabin and stared at the wagon that had rolled up his rutted dirt lane, the kind of lane that wound through lodgepole pines and pale morning frost, the kind that a man only found if he was looking for it or lost enough to stumble upon it by accident. The wagon driver, a pale-faced clerk with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of touching his hat brim, had handed Aaron two things: that burlap-wrapped iron collar and a folded document stamped with the magistrate's wax seal. The document explained, in the clipped language of territorial bureaucracy, that as part of the post-war reparation agreements between the Ironwood territories and the Darkwolf Orc clan, a number of orc women had been designated as war brides to be placed in the households of frontier settlers. It was meant, the document said, to encourage integration, to build peace through proximity. The clerk had the decency to look ashamed as he said it aloud. Aaron was 26 years old, broad-shouldered from years of working his own land, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck when it got too long, and brown eyes that people said were warm enough to thaw a winter well. He had inherited this 40-acre homestead from his father 3 years ago, had spent every waking hour since clearing land, putting in crops, building his barn, digging a root cellar, and learning the 1,000 small arts of staying alive in a place that didn't particularly want you to. He had not asked for a war bride. He had not asked for any of this. But then the second wagon came around the bend in the trees, and Aaron Stone forgot entirely what he had been about to say to the nervous clerk. She was sitting upright in the wagon bed, her hands resting on her knees, her posture the kind of rigid, deliberate stillness that is not peace but control. Bagrak Darkwolf was 23 years old, and she was, without question, the most striking person Aaron had ever seen in his life. She was tall for an orc woman, with the broad, powerful frame of someone who had grown up doing real work fighting, hauling, surviving. Her skin was a deep sage green with warm undertones, smooth and unblemished except for a thin scar that curved from the outer corner of her left eye toward her temple, like a crescent moon laid on its side. Her hair was thick and black as river silt, braided back from her face in a single heavy rope that hung past her shoulder blades. Her tusks were modest by orc standards, twin ivory curves rising from her lower jaw, and her eyes were a vivid, startling amber, the color of pine resin held up to firelight. She wore a fitted leather bodice laced tightly up the front over a deep plum linen blouse, the fabric snug against her figure, the leather cinched at her waist and flared slightly over her hips. Her trousers were dark canvas, tucked into worn but well-made boots that laced up past her ankles. Around her neck, thin and humiliating, was a temporary restraint cord, not iron, not yet, that the second driver, a rough-looking man with a militia patch on his coat, held loosely in one hand as though she were livestock he had grown tired of transporting. What struck Aaron first was not her appearance but her expression. She was not afraid. Her amber eyes swept the homestead, the cabin, the barn half visible through the trees, the garden beds, the split-rail fence with a calculating, dignified intelligence. She was assessing the place the way a person assesses a new battlefield, noting exits, noting threats, noting the character of the ground. When her eyes found Aaron, they stopped. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the iron collar in his hands, looked back at her, and set the collar down on the porch rail behind him. "Cut that cord," he said to the militia driver. The driver blinked. "Sir, regulations state that the—" "I said cut it," Aaron said, and there was something in his voice that made the driver reach for his belt knife without further argument. Bagrak did not move when the cord fell away. She kept her eyes on Aaron, and those amber eyes were unreadable, not grateful, not suspicious, simply watching, waiting to understand what kind of man this was before she made any decisions about him. The clerk was already backing the first wagon in a nervous arc, muttering something about paperwork completed. The militia driver tossed the restraint cord in the wagon bed and left without ceremony. The sound of hooves and wheels faded down the lane through the pines until there was nothing left but wind and birdsong and the distant knock of a woodpecker somewhere in the timber. Aaron walked to the edge of the porch steps and stopped. He did not approach her. He did not reach for her. He simply stood at a respectful distance and said, "My name is Aaron Stone. This is my land. You don't owe me anything and I won't be putting that collar on you. Ever." Bagrak climbed down from the wagon bed with a fluid, unself-conscious grace. She was nearly as tall as he was, and when she stood in the packed dirt of his yard, she looked entirely unintimidated by him, which was something Aaron found he respected enormously. "Bagrak Darkwolf," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, with a slight rasp to it, and her comment was careful and deliberate, as though she had learned it from books rather than from conversation. "Daughter of Bagrak Darkwolf, war leader of the northern Darkwolf Clan, you speak of not owing you anything. But the territory says otherwise." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "Why did you remove the cord?" "Because you're not an animal," Aaron said simply. She blinked. It was small, just a fractional widening of those amber eyes, but Aaron caught it and understood that whatever she had been bracing herself for, it had not been that. "I don't know what you were told to expect," Aaron said, moving carefully down the porch steps and stopping at the bottom. "But this is how it is going to be. You'll have your own room. You'll eat at the table with me. You work if you want to work, and if you want to leave, I'll give you a horse and provisions and point you toward whatever road you're trying to reach." He paused. "The only thing I ask is that you tell me straight what you need." Bagrak studied him for a long time. The morning wind moved through the pine tops and sent a scattering of needles across the yard. Somewhere in the barn, one of his horses shifted and stamped. "You expect me to believe this," she said. Not a question. More like she was turning the words over, looking for the trap. "I expect nothing," Aaron said. "I'm just telling you what's true." She looked at the cabin. Then she looked at the iron collar sitting on the porch rail. Then she looked back at Aaron, and some small, fierce thing in her expression shifted, not by much but enough. "I will stay," she said, "for now." "That's all I'm asking," Aaron said. He showed her around the cabin that morning, moving at an unhurried pace, narrating everything with the practical matter-of-factness of a man explaining his home to a neighbor. The main room with its stone hearth and heavy table, the two small bedrooms, the root cellar door in the kitchen floor, the pantry shelves with their jars of preserved vegetables and dried beans and salt pork. When he showed her to the second bedroom, his father's old room, which Aaron had kept clean without knowing quite why, he opened the door and stepped back to let her go in first. The room was small but not mean. A rope bed with a real feather mattress, a wool blanket folded at the foot, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a small window that looked out toward the tree line. On the sill, someone had left a stub of candle in a clay holder. Bagrak stood in the doorway and was very still for a moment. "This is mine?" she asked. "All yours," Aaron said. He did not see her face in that moment. He was already turning back toward the main room to give her privacy, but if he had, he would have seen something rare and unguarded cross those strong features. Something that looked, briefly, like the first edge of relief. The first week was careful and quiet and full of small tests, none of them deliberate. Bagrak woke before dawn on the first morning and had the hearth fire going and a pot of water heating before Aaron came out of his room. She had found the oats in the pantry and the salt and was standing at the hearth stirring porridge with the same deliberate efficiency she brought to everything. Aaron stood in the doorway in his work clothes and watched her for a moment, and she did not look up, but her shoulders tightened slightly. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I know," she said. He sat down at the table, and she served 2 bowls and sat across from him, and they ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 careful people learning each other's rhythms. After breakfast, Aaron went out to split wood, and 15 minutes later Bagrak appeared at the woodpile without a word, picked up the axe, and began splitting alongside him with a power and precision that made Aaron stop and watch with frank admiration. She was strong, orc strong, which was genuinely impressive, and she had clearly done this kind of labor before. She did not look at him while she worked. He went back to his own splitting. They worked in alternating rhythm for 2 hours without speaking, and the woodpile grew steadily. When they stopped for water, Aaron dipped the ladle from the barrel and handed it to her first. She accepted it, drank, and handed it back. "Your land is good," she said, looking out across the cleared fields. "The soil is dark. You have river access. Creek half a mile east," Aaron said. "I've been wanting to run a channel from it to the garden beds, but I haven't had the time." She nodded, still looking at the fields. "The Darkwolf Clan grows sorghum in ground like this, drought-resistant. The root systems go deep." "I didn't know orc clans farmed," Aaron said, not unkindly, just honest. Bagrak looked at him then, and there was a flash of something behind her amber eyes, not quite offense, but something adjacent to it. "There is much that humans do not know about orcs," she said evenly, "because they have not asked." Aaron nodded. "That's fair, I'm asking now." She studied his face. Then she said, "We farm, we hunt, we build, we make music, we tell stories that are older than this territory. We also fight when we are threatened, which is often." She turned back to the fields. "The Darkwolf Clan has fought for 3 generations to keep our northern lands. The war that brought me here was not something we started." "I know," Aaron said quietly. "I lost people in that war too. A brother, 2 neighbors." He paused. "I don't blame your clan for the war. I'm not sure there's anyone clean enough to point the finger." Bagrak was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your brother, what was he like?" Aaron was not expecting that question. He blinked. "He was funny," he said, "made terrible jokes, good with horses." He looked down at the ladle in his hands. "His name was Daniel. He was 20. Bagrak nodded slowly. "My mother died in the war. She was a healer. She was treating wounded fighters from both sides when the cavalry came through." She said it without decoration, just facts laid out with a kind of quiet dignity that was more devastating than grief. "She was 41 years old." Aaron said, "I'm sorry." Bagrak looked at him. There was that searching quality in her gaze again, looking for the seams of something false. But Aaron just looked back at her, steady and honest, and after a moment she said, "Yes, I think you are." They went back to work. But something had shifted, fine as a hairline crack in stone, and both of them felt it. By the second week, Bagrak had catalogued every weakness in the homestead's defenses, which she mentioned to Aaron over breakfast with the matter-of-fact directness of a military strategist. The front fence had a gap near the north post where a determined person could squeeze through. The barn latch could be lifted from outside by someone who knew what they were doing. The root cellar had only one exit. Aaron listened to all of this with a slightly furrowed brow, and then went out and spent 2 days fixing every single issue she had identified, which she watched with an expression that might, in very good light, have been the beginning of a smile. She also began working in the garden beds, which Aaron had planted haphazardly with whatever seeds the trading post had in stock that spring. She reorganized them with a quiet authority companion planting. She called it something her mother had done, placing certain plants together so they helped each other survive. She said some of the words in Orcish first, as if thinking, then translated them for Aaron. He would repeat the Orcish word back to her, and she would correct his pronunciation without mockery, and he would try again. He was a slow but earnest student, and it made her mouth do something that was not quite a smile but was definitely pointed in that direction. One evening he came in from the fields to find her seated at the table with one of his father's old maps of the territory spread out before her, studying it with her chin resting on one hand. She had lit the lamp, and the warm light turned her sage skin to something almost golden. She looked up when he came in, unhurried, unashamed. "Your eastern boundary is wrong," she said, pointing to a line on the map. "This creek fork that marks it shifted course 2 floods ago. The real boundary is probably 20 yards further east. That's your land." Aaron crossed to the table and leaned over the map beside her, close enough that he could smell the faint cedar and earth scent of her hair. He looked at the map. "How do you know that?" I have walked this territory, she said simply. I was a scout for the clan before the war ended. She traced the original creek line with one finger, then drew a different path. The water moved. These things happen. Aaron stared at the map, genuinely impressed. I should walk the boundary before the season changes. Make sure the markers are right. He paused. Will you come with me? She looked up at him. They were very close, the map between them, the lamp warm between them, and for a moment neither of them moved. Yes, she said. I will come. The boundary walk happened the following Saturday, and it took most of the day because they kept stopping. Bagrak knew this land in a way Aaron was just beginning to learn. She identified tracks, named plants in 2 languages, showed him how to read a creek's age by the way it had worn the stone banks, pointed out where deer had been bedding in a grove of young aspen, and explained the difference between a fresh trail and an old one. Aaron mostly listened, asked questions, and watched her move through the landscape with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had spent years reading wild country. Around midday they stopped at the creek to eat from the provisions. Aaron had packed hard bread, dried venison, a wedge of cheese from his small flock of goats. They sat on a flat boulder near the water, not touching, but closer than they had been before, and they talked for a long time. About the territory, about the war, about what had come before the war and what might, theoretically, come after. Bagrak told him about the Darkwolf Clan's territory to the north, the long granite ridges and the dark forests and the winter that lasted 6 months and was still beautiful. She described the clan's gather hall, a structure made from living trees that had been guided and trained into arches over generations, and Aaron listened to this with such obvious, genuine wonder that she paused mid-description and studied him. You don't find this strange? She asked, to hear an orc speaking of beautiful things. I find it interesting, Aaron said. Why would it be strange? She looked at the creek for a moment. Many people I have encountered in this territory believe that orcs are uncomplicated, that we feel less, think in shorter lines. She said it without obvious bitterness but with the weight of something that had been carried a long time. Those people are wrong, Aaron said. She turned to look at him, and the afternoon light caught the amber of her eyes, and Aaron felt something in his chest shift with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Yes, she said softly, they are. They walked home in the long golden light of late afternoon, their shadows stretching long ahead of them on the lane. Their shoulders brushed once, navigating a narrow section of path, and neither of them moved away. The trouble arrived in the 3rd week, which was later than Aaron had expected if he was honest with himself. He had needed to go into the town of Ridgefall for supplies: flour, lamp oil, nails, and a new handle for the broken hoe. Ridgefall was not a large town. It had a main street, a general store, a smithy, a tavern that doubled as a post exchange, and the kind of mutual watchfulness that small frontier communities develop when they have survived hard times together. Aaron had been part of its fabric since birth. He was liked, trusted, considered a steady and quiet neighbor. He had not intended to bring Bagrak, but she had said, with the flat practicality that was becoming familiar to him, that she needed to know the layout of the nearest town and that she would accompany him, and he had found he didn't want to tell her no. They came into Ridgefall on the wagon, Aaron handling the reins, Bagrak seated beside him on the bench. The reaction began before they had cleared the main street's first block. Heads turning, conversations stopping, a woman pulling her child behind her skirts. 2 men outside the smithy going very still, their hands loose at their sides. Aaron kept his face neutral and drove the wagon straight and unhurried to the hitching post outside the general store. He climbed down. He walked around to Bagrak's side and offered his hand to help her down from the bench, a simple, ordinary courtesy he would have extended to any passenger. She looked at his hand for a beat, then took it, and he helped her step down to the street. The watching crowd was fully watching now. Holt Greer, who owned the general store and had known Aaron since boyhood, came out onto the boardwalk with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that Aaron had seen before and didn't like. Behind Holt, 2 other men from town, Carver Mills and Jed Aldous, Both veterans of the territorial war had drifted out of the tavern and were standing in the street, watching. "Aaron," Holt said, in a voice that was trying to be friendly and wasn't quite making it. "What's this you've brought?" "This is Bagrak," Aaron said, easy and clear. "She's with me. We're here for supplies." Holt's eyes moved to Bagrak with the kind of look that was not subtle and was not trying to be. Bagrak stood beside the wagon with her spine straight and her chin level, looking back at Holt with those amber eyes that revealed nothing. She was magnificent in her stillness. "We heard about the magistrate's new program," Carver Mills said from behind Holt. He was a thick-shouldered man with a veteran's squint. "Didn't know it meant bringing one of them into town like she's regular folk." "She is regular folk," Aaron said. "She's Darkwolf Clan," Jed Aldous said, and he spat into the street dust. "Half of us in this town lost people to Darkwolf raiders. You're going to walk her down our street like she's your wife." Aaron stood very still on the boardwalk. Bagrak had not moved, she had not flinched. But Aaron saw, and no one else was close enough to see, that her hands, which were at her sides, had curled very slightly inward, and he understood that she had done this 10,000 times. Stood still while people decided her fate with their mouths, while she kept every feeling locked inside her own chest where it could not be used against her. Something in Aaron went very quiet and very certain. He turned to face Jed Aldous and Carver Mills directly, and his voice was even and low and left no room for misunderstanding. "She is under my roof and under my protection. That means she's under the protection of every courtesy and decency this town offers to any person who walks its street without causing harm. If anyone here can show me where she has caused harm today, I will hear it. Otherwise, we are going into the store for supplies." A long, charged silence. In it, Aaron was aware of every eye on them. The woman with the child still watching from the doorway of the milliner's shop, 3 young men on the tavern porch, a farmer he didn't know on the far side of the street, his hands on his wagon wheels. Holt Greer unfolded his arms. He was not a bad man, Aaron knew. He was a frightened man, and frightened men sometimes became something other than their better selves. But Holt had also been Aaron Stone's neighbor his whole life, and there was something in Aaron's voice that Holt recognized, the same quiet, unmoving quality he had seen in Aaron's father, and it moved something in him. "Come inside," Holt said, not warmly but not unkindly either. "I'll fill your order." Carver Mills made a low, disgusted sound but didn't move. Jed Aldous said nothing more. Aaron put his hand at the small of Bagrak's back gently, briefly, just the lightest contact, and guided her through the store door. Inside, in the spice and sawdust smell of the general store, Bagrak let out a single slow breath. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, moving toward the shelf of lamp oil. "Yes, I did," Aaron said, reaching past her for the flour. She looked at him sidelong. Their arms were nearly touching in the narrow aisle. "Why?" Aaron thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Because it was right, and because you shouldn't have to stand there taking it." Bagrak looked at the shelf of goods for a moment. Then she said, still quietly, "In the clan, when a warrior stands in front of someone who cannot be seen, shields them, we say they have made a debt of blood. It is a serious thing." "I don't want a debt," Aaron said. "I just want you to be able to buy lamp oil in peace." She turned to look at him fully, and the amber of her eyes was very warm in the dim store light, and for a long moment she just looked at him. Then she took the lamp oil from the shelf and carried it to the counter, and Aaron brought the flour, and they did their shopping and went home, and the town watched them go with eyes that had shifted, if only fractionally, toward something less certain. The seasons moved. October came with its slow gold decay, the aspen going brilliant, the nights sharpening. Aaron and Bagrak fell into a working rhythm as natural and unthought about as breathing. She rose early, he rose early. They worked the land through the morning, ate together at noon, worked through the afternoon, cooked together in the evening. They talked slowly at first, then more freely, then with the easy conversational depth that builds between people who have begun to genuinely know each other. He learned. She was the second of 3 children, the only daughter. She had been a scout and tracker for 5 years. She made decisions carefully and then committed to them without second guessing. She had a wry, dry humor that emerged slowly, at unexpected moments, like a spring appearing through rock, and when it appeared it was devastating. She thought in images more than in words, and when she described things, landscapes, memories, ideas, she described them with a visual specificity that made him see what she was seeing. She learned. He was the kind of quiet that was not emptiness but depth. He kept his word without needing to announce that he was doing so. He was genuinely interested in everything, in the mechanics of a thing, in the history behind it, in what people made of it afterward. He laughed rarely but sincerely. He made excellent bread, which he was oddly modest about. He slept lightly and woke at the smallest strange sound, which she recognized as a survival habit and respected. One evening in late October, sitting at the hearth after supper with the fire burning low and the wind working itself up outside, Aaron looked up from his mending and said, without preamble, "I found something in the barn today that I think belongs to you." Bagrak looked up from the piece of leather she was oiling. Aaron went to the mantel and brought back a small wooden carving, a wolf, no longer than his thumb, rough-made but recognizable, clearly of clan origin from the specific knotwork pattern carved into the base. Bagrak went very still when she saw it. Then she set down the leather and took the carving from his hand, and he saw something move across her face that was raw and unguarded, something he had not seen before. "This is clan work," she said. Her voice was careful. "I figured," Aaron said. "Thought maybe it was something you'd had with you when you came." She turned the carving over in her hands. "My brother made this," she said. "Rocco. He made one for each of his family before the war took him." She pressed her thumb against the wolf's back. "I thought it was lost. I had nothing when they brought me here." Aaron sat back down across from her and said nothing for a moment. The fire snapped and settled. "I found it in a gap between the floor planks in the north stall. Maybe it fell out of your pack when you first came. I don't know." Bagrak closed her fingers around the carving. She was holding herself very still in the way she did when feeling something large. "He was 19, she said very quietly. "Rocco, 19 years old." Aaron said, "I'm sorry." The same words he had said that first week, but they meant something different now, fuller, more personal. The kind of sorry that comes from knowing. Bagrak looked at the fire. "You and I have lost the same things," she said, "from opposite sides of the same war." "Yes," Aaron said, "we have." She looked at him across the warm room, the fire between them, the wolf carving in her fist, and in her amber eyes was something he had not been able to name before now. He could almost name it now. He was not yet ready to say it aloud. November came and brought the first real cold, and with it a crisis that pushed everything else aside. A late-season storm rolled off the northern mountains with no warning, the kind of storm that old frontier settlers called a widowmaker, because it caught people out without shelter. Aaron was caught in the north field when it hit, trying to cover the last of the root crop, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 20 minutes, and the snow came in sideways and white blinding. He made it to the barn but not the cabin, and he spent that first terrible hour trying to decide if he could reach the cabin through a near whiteout. Inside the cabin, Bagrak waited 4 minutes after the storm hit, then put on Aaron's heavy coat over her leather bodice and blouse, took a length of rope from the hook by the door, tied one end to the porch post, and walked out into the storm. She found him in the barn. He was cold but not yet in danger, huddled with the horses for warmth, and when she pushed the barn door open on a blast of horizontal snow and stood there with the rope end in her hand and snow plastering her braid against her shoulder, he stared at her with an expression she would remember for years. "Come," she said. He followed the rope and she followed it before him, and they got back to the cabin, and the door shut out the howling, and it was warm and bright inside, and Aaron stood dripping snow and stared at her and said, "You went out in that." "You were in the barn," she said, as if this was a complete explanation. He crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped both hands around her cold, reddened face and looked at her very intensely, and she looked back at him, startled by the closeness, the warmth of his palms against her cold cheeks, the particular quality of his expression. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper. Bagrak felt the warmth of his hands against her face, and something inside her, something she had been keeping very carefully locked and buried, shifted loose. She reached up and wrapped both of her hands around his wrists, not pushing his hands away but holding them in place against her cheeks, and they stayed like that for a long moment, the storm screaming outside, the hearth fire steady and golden behind them. "You would have done the same," she said. "I would have," he said. "I would have." He let his hands drop then, slowly, reluctantly, and they sat by the fire while their clothes dried on pegs and drank hot tea, and the storm raged for hours and hours, and eventually wore itself down to a whisper. And the whole time they talked, huddled close in the firelight, their words ranging wide and deeper than they had ever gone, across every country of thought and feeling and memory and dream, that two people share only when they have stopped being guarded with each other. He told her about his father, who had been a quiet man, good but distant, the kind of father whose love was unmistakable and impossible to access. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and how he had learned to cook and mend and manage a household out of simple necessity. He told her about the night he had decided to stay on the land after his father died, how he had sat on this very porch in the dark and thought about leaving for the city for something easier, and had looked out at the fields and thought, "No, this is mine, and I am going to make it worth something." She told him about the gather hall of the Darkwolf Clan, where on winter nights every family in the clan would come together with food and fire and story singers, orcs, who had committed to memory the clan's history going back 300 years. She told him about learning to scout, about her first solo mission in the Northern Timber at 17, about the fear and the exhilaration of reading a landscape alone, responsible only to herself. She told him about the war's end and the tribunal that had designated orc women as war brides, how she had stood before the human magistrates with her clan chief's mark on her arm and refused to show fear, because Darkwolf women did not show fear to those who wished to diminish them. "Were you afraid?" Aaron asked. She considered this for a moment. Then, "I was afraid of what I would be used for, not of any particular man." She looked at the fire. "And they brought me to your lane and you set down the collar." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "And what does that mean to you now, being here?" Bagrak looked at him, not the fire at him. "It means something different than it did," she said, 3 weeks ago. The storm outside had gone to a low moan. The fire burned gold and steady. Aaron met her gaze and felt that unnamed thing in his chest pressing to be named. "Different how?" he asked very quietly. She took a long breath. 3 weeks ago, I was a prisoner who had been handed a comfortable cell," she said. "Now I am." She paused, feeling for the word in common that matched what she meant in her own language. "I am someone who woke up one day and found she was not in a cell at all, that the walls she was feeling were the ones she had built herself." She looked at her hands. "You have not put walls around me, Aaron Stone. You have not put anything around me except—" She stopped. "Except what?" he asked. She looked up. "Safety," she said, "which I did not know I was missing until I found it." The fire crackled and settled. Aaron reached out and put his hand over hers on the arm of her chair. Just his hand over hers, warm and deliberate, the first touch that was not practical, not accidental, not the brief contact of proximity but something offered. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They sat like that until the storm fully passed, their hands intertwined in the golden firelight, the cabin warm and solid around them, the world outside buried in new white snow. December was the month he gave her the key. It happened without ceremony, which was somehow exactly right. Aaron had been at the trading post in Ridgefall getting the cabin's winter lock fitted, an iron mechanism, good and heavy, the kind that wouldn't give to a careless wind. And when he came home and fit the new lock to the front door, he turned the key once, examined the mechanism, and then held it out to Bagrak without preamble. She was standing in the doorway watching him work, her arms loosely folded, her braid over one shoulder. She looked at the key in his outstretched hand. "This is the key to the front door," she said. Only key, Aaron confirmed. I'll get a second one made in the spring. Bagrak took the key from his hand and looked at it. It was iron, old style, worn smooth at the bow from the locksmith's handling. She closed her fingers around it. You are giving me the only key, she said. You live here, Aaron said simply. It's your home as much as mine. She looked up from the key to his face, and what was in her expression was not small. It was large and old and very quiet, the kind of feeling that doesn't make noise. She held the key in her closed fist. In the clan, she said after a moment, a man gives a woman the key of his house only when he is asking her to stay. Aaron held her gaze. He did not look away. I know, he said, because he had heard enough clan tradition from her by now that he did know, and he had not handed her the key by accident. Bagrak Darkwolf stood in the doorway of the cabin with the winter light behind her and the key in her hand, and looked at the man who had removed her cord on the first day and given her a room and talked to her like a person and stood between her and a hostile town and held her face in his warm hands in a blizzard. Aaron, she said. Yes, he said. I would like to stay, she said. He smiled then, full and warm and without reservation, and she felt the impact of that smile like sun after a long winter. He crossed the threshold to her and put one hand along the side of her jaw, and she leaned her cheek into his palm with a deliberateness that undid him, and he said her name once, Bagrak, soft and certain, and then he kissed her. It was a first kiss that felt, paradoxically, like something remembered rather than discovered, warm and unhurried and deeply true, his thumb tracing her cheekbone, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, the key pressed between her palm and his heartbeat. They stood in the open doorway of the cabin with the cold winter air at their backs and the hearth fire warm ahead of them and kissed until it meant something that neither of them would ever quite be able to put into words. When they broke apart, Bagrak pressed her forehead against his and closed her eyes and said in Orcish the word that meant, roughly translated, home person, the one who makes a place home. She had not planned to say it. It arrived from somewhere deep and honest in her. What does that mean? Aaron asked quietly. She opened her eyes and looked at him, close, amber meeting brown. It means you, she said. The winter they spent together settled over the homestead like the snow itself, deep and soft, and transforming the landscape into something quieter and more beautiful than it was the rest of the year. Inside the cabin, the hearth was always burning. The evenings grew into rituals. Aaron mending tack or sharpening tools or reading from his small library of maps and agricultural texts. Bagrak across from him working leather or speaking into the quiet, teaching him Orcish words while he taught her the names of every field and fence line on the property. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just existed in the same warm space with the satisfaction of two people who have found that another person's company is, against all expectation, the most natural thing in the world. They were careful with each other in those first weeks after the kiss, feeling the new shape of things, not rushing. They held hands by the fire. They woke in the mornings with the awareness of each other in the next room and found it changed the taste of the morning coffee. He was openly, consistently affectionate, the hand at her back, the shoulder brush that lingered, the way he looked up from whatever he was doing when she spoke as if what she said was the most interesting thing in the room, which she was beginning to believe he genuinely thought it was. She was less practiced in softness. She had spent years in a culture that expressed care through action and reliability rather than tenderness. But she showed him things. She repaired the split in his best boot without being asked, leaving it on the step outside his room one morning. She brought him small things from the woods, a particularly perfect cone, an interesting rock from the creek bed, a feather she had identified by species and left on the table beside his tea. She learned, watching him, that he rubbed the back of his neck when he was trying to work out a problem, and she started noticing when he was doing it and asking what he was thinking, and the gratitude in his face when he answered, when someone just noticed and asked, was something she tucked away and kept. January brought a hard cold that tested the cabin's chinking, and they spent a Saturday morning patching the gaps with clay and hay together, working their way around the exterior walls with wooden paddles, standing close, their breath coming in plumes. Their gloved hands bumped and tangled, and she left her shoulder against his for a long moment of warmth, and he pressed back, and neither of them said anything about it, but both of them were smiling at the wall. That night the cold was brutal, and sometime before dawn Aaron woke to a sound from Bagrak's room, not a cry or distress, but a low, rhythmic sound he took a moment to identify as her shivering in the grip of real cold. The clay patching had not cured yet, and the bedroom walls were losing heat. He lay in his own warm bed with 2 wool blankets and listened for a minute, then got up and knocked on her door. She opened it, wrapped in the single blanket, her braid coming loose, her amber eyes wide and unself-conscious in the dimness. "Your room is colder," he said. "I noticed," she said dryly, and he laughed, and she was startled by the laugh and then not startled, and her mouth curved. "Come sleep by the hearth," he said. "I'll put down the floor pallet." They dragged the pallet mattress from the storage bench and laid it in front of the banked hearth fire, and Aaron put both their blankets on it, and they lay down side by side in the firelight with the warmth of the coals on their faces and the cold held at bay. He was on his back. She was on her side facing the fire, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him. Neither of them slept immediately. "Aaron," she said quietly. "Yes." "I am glad," she said, "that they brought me here. I did not think I would ever say that." He turned his head to look at her profile in the firelight, the strong line of her jaw, the curve of her tusk, the sweep of her brow, the way the fire turned her skin to hammered bronze. "I am too," he said. She turned her head, and their faces were close in the firelight, and they looked at each other for a long, warm moment, and then she settled, closing her eyes, her breath evening out, and he watched her until she was asleep, and then lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought about how thoroughly his understanding of the word home had changed in 4 months. The winter passed. February gave way to a raw March, and March to the mud and tentative green of April. They planted the south field together, Aaron working the plow and Bagrak working the rows behind him, both of them dirty and tired and laughing by mid-afternoon, when Aaron slipped in the mud and went down on one knee with a sound of genuinely surprised dismay. Bagrak pulled him up by the arm with her considerable strength and then did not let go of the arm, and he did not extract it, and they walked back to the cabin for lunch with his hand in hers, muddy boots squelching in unison. That spring ridgefall slowly, grudgingly, shifted. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen because the town had a change of heart about orcs. It happened the way most real change happens in small communities, one specific interaction at a time, small enough to not require anyone to formally revise their position. It began when Bagrak helped save the Holloway farm. The Holloways were an older couple, their children grown and gone, their closest neighbor a 3-mile ride east. In late April, John Holloway's barn caught fire from a kicked-over lantern, and by the time the smoke was visible from the stone homestead, it was already serious. Aaron and Bagrak went on horseback without discussion, riding hard, and when they arrived the barn roof was going and John Holloway was trying to get his livestock out, and his wife was pumping water from the well alone, working faster than a woman of 60 years should have to work. What happened in the next 2 hours was not heroic in any dramatic sense. It was the unglamorous heroism of work, bucket lines and wet burlap and controlled backfires, and Bagrak organizing the whole thing with a quiet, decisive authority that made people follow her without thinking about it. She stationed Aaron on the water pump. She got the livestock into the far paddock. She directed 2 of John's neighboring farmers, who had ridden up minutes after Aaron and Bagrak, to soak the adjacent granary with water to keep the fire from jumping. When the barn roof collapsed in a roar of orange sparks and rising black smoke, everyone was clear, everything savable had been saved, and the granary was standing and dry. John Holloway had a burn on his forearm that needed treating, and his wife had turned her ankle on the uneven ground. Bagrak dealt with both, the burn cleaned, and wrapped with cloth she had soaked in creek water, the ankle bound with a strip from her own blouse's inner hem, with the same efficient practicality. She was speaking quietly to Martha Holloway, who was sitting on the ground and crying from relief, when Aaron looked across the ruined, smoking yard and saw old John Holloway watching Bagrak with an expression Aaron could only describe as recognition, not of her specifically, of what she was. On the ride home in the long spring dusk, their horses walking side by side on the lane, Bagrak said, "Your people lose so much to fire. Your buildings are too flammable." "Is that an architectural critique?" Aaron asked. "Yes," she said entirely seriously. "Stone and clay are better. The clans hold houses have earthen walls. They breathe and they burn poorly." "Maybe we can build something like that," Aaron said, looking at her profile in the dying light. "Something that lasts." She looked back at him and understood that they were talking about more than buildings and said, "Yes, I would like that." John and Martha Holloway came to the homestead 2 weeks later with a wheel of cheese and a jar of preserved peaches, and the kind of straightforward, unpretentious gratitude that is more valuable than any formal apology for past suspicion. Martha Holloway held Bagrak's hands and said, "You have a gift for calm in a crisis." And Bagrak said, "My mother taught me that panic is the enemy of action." And Martha Holloway nodded as if this was entirely ordinary wisdom from an entirely ordinary person, which was exactly what it was. It was not the town of Ridgefall transformed, but it was a crack in the wall, and cracks spread. By summer, Aaron's crops were the best he had ever grown, partly because of Bagrak's companion planting and partly because they were working them together. And two careful, attentive people with different kinds of knowledge are better farmers than one. The sorghum she had mentioned in that very first week they grew in the east field, and it came up strong and golden. And when the trading post in Ridgefall saw it, they put in an order, and Aaron got a better price per bushel than he had expected. That summer was also the summer Aaron built Bagrak, something she had not asked for, but that he had been thinking about since March. He spent 3 weeks on it in the evenings after supper, working by lantern light in the barn. And when it was done, he showed her on a Friday evening in late July, leading her out to the barn with his hands over her eyes, which she submitted to with magnificent dignity and a kind of suppressed anticipation. It was a workbench, her own workbench, fitted to her height slightly higher than Aaron's, accounting for the difference between them, with a rack for her leather tools and a shelf for her supplies and a small carved wolf on the corner, modeled imperfectly but recognizably after the carving her brother Rocco had made. Bagrak stood in front of it for a long moment with her hands at her sides. Then she turned around and looked at Aaron, and her face was entirely open. No armor, no calculation, no careful management of what she let him see. Just her, full and real and uncovered. She crossed to him in 2 steps and took his face in her hands and kissed him the way she had learned he liked. Thorough and warm and very intentional. The kind of kiss that says, "I see you completely and I choose you anyway." And Aaron's hands came up to her waist and he kissed her back the same way, and it was very good, and the horses were politely uninterested. "You carved the wolf," she said against his mouth. "I tried," he said. "It looks more like a dog." She laughed, that rare, full laugh that was still new enough to feel like a gift, and he pulled her in and held her in the warm barn smell of hay and horses, her head against his shoulder, his chin resting on the top of her head, and they stayed like that in the lantern light for a long time, completely at rest. The late summer brought a reckoning that neither of them could have anticipated, and it arrived in the form of a man on a gray horse. His name was Broker Vane, and he was, in the language of the territorial bureaucracy, an enforcement officer for the War Bride Compliance Program, which meant he rode a circuit of frontier homesteads checking that the terms of the post-war reparation placement had been followed. He arrived one August afternoon while Aaron was in the fields and Bagrak was at her workbench, and she heard the horse on the lane and came out to the porch and recognized immediately by the cut of his coat and the militia badge what he represented. She was standing on the porch steps with her arms at her sides when Broker Vane rode up and dismounted. He was a spare, angular man in his 40s with a meticulous mustache and eyes that were not cruel but were completely without warmth. The eyes of a man who had organized his entire inner life around compliance and procedure. He looked at Bagrak the way men like him always looked at her, as a category, not a person. War bride, stone homestead. Bagrak Darkwolf, Darkwolf Clan placement, he said, consulting a ledger he had taken from his saddlebag. Where is Aaron Stone? In the field, Bagrak said. Fetch him. Bagrak said nothing for a moment. She looked at this man steadily. Then she said, he will be here at supper time. You are welcome to wait. And she turned and went inside. Vane spent the next 2 hours on the porch because Bagrak had not invited him in and he was too busy being affronted by this to think around it. When Aaron came up the lane from the field and saw the gray horse and the official at his porch, he quickened his pace. Vane had his ledger out and was making notes before Aaron had fully arrived. Aaron Stone, I'm conducting a compliance review of war bride placements in this district. Standard procedure, nothing to be alarmed about. He looked up. I'll need to observe the compliance collar fitting. Regulations state that war brides are to be fitted with. No, Aaron said. Vane blinked. I beg your pardon. There is no collar on this homestead and there won't be, Aaron said. His voice was level. I read the placement regulations when I received the paperwork. There is no binding legal requirement for a compliance collar. It is listed as a recommendation, and I am declining it. Vane's jaw moved. The recommendation exists for a reason, Mr. Stone. These are Darkwolf women. The security, Bagrak Darkwolf, Aaron said, has been on this homestead for 5 months. She has helped bring in the best harvest this farm has seen. She saved a neighbor's property from fire. She has not left, not because she is collared, but because he paused, and his voice was very quiet and very steady, because she has chosen to stay. That is a different thing entirely, and it is a thing I will not compromise. Vane looked from Aaron to the cabin door where Bagrak had appeared and was standing in the doorway, watching this exchange with those amber eyes flat and unreadable. Vane clicked his pen against his ledger. You understand that non-compliance could result in removal of the placement. Removal, Aaron said. He looked very directly at Vane. Let me be clear about something. Bagrak is not a placement. She is the woman I intend to marry, and if you attempt to remove her from this property, I will be at the magistrate's office at first light with every territorial statute on voluntary placement dissolution and citizen partnership rights I can find. I have already looked them up. Another silence. Vane's mouth worked slightly. Behind Aaron, from the porch, he heard Bagrak make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the involuntary escape of something too large to contain. Vane wrote in his ledger. Then he closed it and put it away and said, in the tone of a man who has decided to see nothing, I will note the placement as stable and satisfactory. He mounted the gray horse. Good day, Mr. Stone. He rode away down the lane without looking back. Aaron turned to the porch. Bagrak was standing there with the door frame behind her and the afternoon light on her face, and her expression was something enormous and warm and complicated. You intend to marry me, she said. Aaron climbed the porch steps. He was slightly flushed, which was endearing. I do, he said, if you'll have me. He looked at her very steadily, this man who had removed her cord on the first day and given her a room and the only key, and stood in front of her every time the world tried to come at her sideways. I should have asked you properly before saying it to an enforcement officer, and I apologize for that. Bagrak looked at him for a long, long moment. The late sun was in his hair, making it warm brown. A farm sparrow was singing from the fence post. The fields were gold in the August light. Ask me now, she said. He took both her hands in his. Bagrak Darkwolf, will you marry me? Yes, she said immediately before he could say anything else. Yes, without question. He pulled her in and she went, and they stood on the porch in the gold August afternoon and held each other, and she pressed her face against his neck and said his name quietly, Aaron, just his name, the way you say something that has become part of you. They were married in September, not in the church in Ridgefall, which had not yet come to a comfortable relationship with the idea, but outdoors at the homestead, in the clearing between the cabin and the barn, in the long amber light of an autumn afternoon. They kept it small by necessity and large by nature. John and Martha Holloway came and brought their grandson. Holt Greer came from the general store and surprised Aaron by bringing a handshake and a genuine smile. Two of the younger farmers from the surrounding area, who had been slowly warming to Bagrak's presence at market days, came with their wives. One old orc woman named Gracia, who lived on the territory's edge and had been watching developments at the stone homestead with hawkish interest through a network of contacts Aaron didn't fully understand, came on a mule and brought a traditional Darkwolf Clan blessing gift. A length of dark green cloth woven with a wolf claw pattern that she told Bagrak was the closest thing to a clan blessing she could arrange in the absence of a clan elder. Bagrak wore the green cloth over her leather bodice and blouse, draped across one shoulder in the Darkwolf fashion. She wore her hair unbraided for the first time. It fell past her shoulder blades in thick, loose waves, and she wore a single carved bone comb Aaron had made for her in the shape of a running wolf, worked into the waves above her temple. Aaron stood in the clearing in his good coat and watched her walk toward him across the grass with the autumn leaves coming down around them in slow gold spirals, and whatever had been building in his chest since that first morning on the porch when he had looked at a stranger and decided she deserved better. It arrived, fully, as a warmth so complete it felt like a kind of clarity. The ceremony was conducted by old Gracia, who combined human vow structure with Darkwolf blessing tradition in a way that was imperfect and beautiful. And when it came to the vows Aaron and Bagrak had written together at the kitchen table the previous week, they said them to each other in both common and Orcish alternating languages, Aaron's Orcish still rough around the edges but earnest, which made Bagrak's eyes go bright. He slid a simple iron band onto her finger. She slid its twin onto his. Iron, not gold, durable and honest and workable, which was how they lived. When old Gracia said the word that meant sealed and done in Darkwolf tradition, Aaron kissed his wife, and someone, probably Martha Holloway, made a sound that was entirely happy, and the autumn afternoon opened up around them like a field after harvest, wide and light and promising. That night after the guests had gone and the clearing was quiet, and the harvest moon had risen enormous and amber over the tree line, Aaron banked the hearth fire low and Bagrak set the wolf carving on the windowsill where the moonlight could find it, and they stood together in the warm cabin in the quiet. And the weight of the day of 5 months and a key and a cord cut in a drive lane, and 1,000 small acts of grace settled around them like something earned. He took her hand and they went to bed as the husband and wife they were, in the room that had been his father's and then a guest room and then hers and was now theirs, in the home that was both of theirs in every way that mattered. The moonlight came through the window and touched the wolf on the sill, and the hearth coals gave a last warm sigh, and the night closed around the homestead. What happened between them then was tender and deliberate and deeply personal, the kind of closeness that two people reach only when they have built real trust. The warmth of his hands and the warmth of her skin, and the steady, quiet certainty of finally, and the old loneliness of both of them dissolving in it like frost in full sun. They were unhurried and unguarded and wholly present with each other, and it was the most honest either of them had been in years, and afterward they lay in the dark with the moonlight between them and their hands intertwined and the sounds of the homestead breathing around them, and Bagrak said quietly in Orcish first and then in common, "I did not know it could be like this." Aaron turned his head to look at her in the silver light. "Like what?" "Like coming home," she said, "inside a person." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, against the iron band, and said nothing, because some things were true enough to not need words. The first winter as husband and wife was different from the first winter of careful strangers. The cabin felt different now in a way that was impossible to quantify precisely, but was entirely real, warmer, fuller, more organized in the specific way that two people who have settled into each other organize a space together. Her leather tools had migrated to the main room's work shelf. His maps had developed annotations in both Common and Orcish. The hearth had accumulated small objects that belonged to neither of them specifically but to both: a smooth stone from the creek, a pressed autumn leaf, the carved wolf, a copper button that had fallen off nobody's coat but which neither of them threw away. They talked about the spring planting in December. They talked about expanding the root cellar in January. They talked about whether to add a second barn stall. Aaron's horse had developed an opinion about another horse in the district that was available for good work, and Bagrak calculated the lumber requirements by memory from measurements she had taken of the current barn wall, and Aaron wrote them down and went to the mill in Ridgefall and placed the order. In February, Bagrak told Aaron she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, before breakfast, sitting across the table from him with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching his face with the careful attention she had brought to every significant moment in her life. He went very still. Then something moved across his face in sequence: surprise, and then a kind of disbelief, and then something that cracked open into warmth so large she could see it from across the table like a fire lit in a dark room. He set down his cup and came around the table and went down on his knees beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her face with that open, full, unguarded look that she loved because she had earned it. "Are you well?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said. "I have been feeling fine for 3 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I said." 3 weeks, he said, with an expression of loving exasperation. "You were certain for 3 weeks." "I am a scout," she said. "I gather information before I report." He laughed and pressed his forehead against their joined hands and stayed there for a moment, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her knuckles and put her free hand gently on top of his dark curled hair. "A child," he said quietly into the space between them. "A child," she confirmed. He looked up at her. "Bagrak," he said, and then he could not find more words and didn't need them. She pulled him gently up and he sat on the arm of her chair and she leaned into his side and they sat together in the morning light coming through the cabin window, the frost on the panes outside, the hearth warm, the farm quiet and waiting in its winter sleep. Spring came, and with it something no one on the homestead had anticipated: visitors from the north. Bagrak was in the garden bed setting the early planting when she heard horses on the lane, and she stood up straight and looked, and went very still. There were 4 riders, all orc, all in Darkwolf Clan markings, the dark blue and gray of the northern clans, and at their head was a young man whose profile was so familiar to Bagrak that for a moment she did not breathe. He was not her brother Rocco. Rocco was gone. But he looked enough like Rocco that her chest did something ancient and painful, and then the young man turned and she saw his face fully and recognized him. Jorvo, her youngest cousin, who had been 14 when she last saw him and was now, by her calculation, 19 or 20, grown into a tall, serious young man with their clan's amber eyes. She called Aaron's name. He came out of the barn in time to stand beside her as the riders dismounted in the yard. The lead rider, a woman in her 40s, a clan sub-chief named Daru whom Bagrak knew and respected, raised her hand in the Darkwolf greeting gesture and said in Orcish, "Bagrak of the Darkwolf, we have come a long way to see that you are alive." Bagrak answered in Orcish, automatic and warm, and then caught herself and said in Common, "This is my husband, Aaron Stone. Aaron, this is Daru of the Northern Hold. And Jorvo, my cousin." She looked at Jorvo and said nothing else because there was too much in it, and he looked back at her with those amber eyes that were so like her mother's, and the formality of the greeting broke slightly for a moment while they looked at each other across the yard. Aaron said, in passable Orcish enough for a greeting, enough to mean it, "You are welcome to this home. Come inside." Sub-Chief Daru looked at Aaron Stone for a long, assessing moment. Then she looked at Bagrak. Then she looked at the homestead, the well-kept cabin, the ordered fields, the garden beds with their companion planting, the barn with its new stall, with the eyes of someone who had expected something and found something else entirely. "He speaks the greeting," she said to Bagrak in Orcish. "He has been learning," Bagrak said, with the particular tone that was not quite pride but was not pride. They came inside and they sat at Aaron's table, and Bagrak served tea and Aaron brought out the smoked sausage and the good bread, and Daru told Bagrak what had happened in the north since the war ended. The clan had survived, contracted in territory but intact, the clan chief still in place, the younger generation rebuilding the holds. Jorvo told her about the family and the careful, edited way of someone managing what they say about grief, which meant she understood that there was more than she was being told, but that the core of the clan was whole. And Daru told her the real reason for the visit. The Territorial Council had opened a renegotiation of the post-war reparation terms, and part of what the Darkwolf Clan was pushing for was the formal dissolution of the war bride program. They wanted documentation from placed women about their actual conditions, testimony that could go before the council. They wanted Bagrak's. Bagrak looked at Aaron. He nodded once. She told them the truth, which was, the program was unjust and degrading by design. The collar she had been sent with was an obscenity. The clerk who had delivered her had been ashamed of himself, which was the only decent thing about the transaction. The town of Ridgefall had been hostile. The institutional framework assumed her to be property. And then she told them the rest, that Aaron Stone had set down the collar on the first day, that he had handed her the key on the third week, that she had stood in his front yard in November and chosen to stay, that she had married him in September under a Darkwolf Clan blessing and a harvest moon, and that she was going to have his child, and that the homestead they were sitting in was her home in every sense of the word. Daru was very quiet during all of this. She looked at the iron band on Bagrak's finger. She looked at the wolf carving on the windowsill. She looked at Aaron Stone, who was sitting at the far end of his table drinking tea and making every effort to be present without intruding, which Daru could see was a studied and genuine effort. "He is not what I expected," Daru said in Orcish, as if Aaron were not in the room. "He never is," Bagrak said, and the warmth in her voice was so unguarded and so complete that even Jorvo, who was young and had been trying hard to be formally dignified throughout, looked down at the table with something that might have been a smile. Daru stayed 2 days. They were good days, full and complicated and rich. Bagrak and Daru walked the boundary of the homestead on the second morning, talking in Orcish about the clan and about the north and about the reparation council. And Aaron took Jorvo to the barn and showed him the new stall construction, and they managed a halting conversation in mixed Common and Orcish about horses, which Jorvo turned out to know a great deal about. And by the end of it, Aaron had traded a story about Daniel's skill with horses for something Jorvo knew about Bagrak as a child that made Aaron laugh, until he had to sit down on the fence rail. When Daru left on the third morning, she clasped Bagrak's forearms in the Darkwolf formal farewell and said, quietly and only to her, "Your mother would be glad of this place you have made." Bagrak did not cry. She held Daru's gaze and said, "I know," and then, "Tell the clan we are here. Tell them the door is open." Jorvo, mounting his horse in the yard, looked down at Aaron and said carefully in Common, "She is very important to all of us." "To me too," Aaron said. Jorvo nodded, with the solemnity of a young man making a formal assessment and finding it satisfactory. Then he rode away up the lane with the others, into the spring morning and the northern road, and the sound of horses faded into the pines. Aaron came to stand beside Bagrak in the yard, and she was watching the lane after the riders, and her expression was quiet and full. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood like that until the last sound of hooves had gone. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Full," she said. "Like too many things at once. Good full or hard full?" She thought about that, both, the way spring is. She looked at him, tilting her head slightly. "He said I am important to all of them, Jorvo." "I know," Aaron said. "I heard." "And you said I am important to you." "You are everything to me," Aaron said, without decoration. She turned into him and pressed her face against the side of his neck and held on for a long moment in the spring sunlight, and he held her back, his hand in her hair, the land around them going green and alive. Their son was born in November, on a night of hard wind and no snow, in the cabin by the hearth fire with Martha Holloway as midwife and old Gracia, arrived from the territory's edge as if she had known, which Aaron increasingly believed she simply did. The birth was hard but not dangerous. Bagrak was terrifyingly, magnificently calm through the worst of it, focused in the way she was focused on everything that mattered, and Aaron stayed beside her the whole time and was held to her hand with a grip that left marks, which he was enormously proud of. The child was a boy. He was born with his father's dark hair and his mother's sage skin and his own considerable pair of lungs. He had small tusks, barely visible, that would grow in more clearly over the first year. He had amber eyes that shifted between his mother's vivid amber and his father's warm brown depending on the light and the hour. And he was, on first sight, the most interesting person either of them had ever seen. Aaron held his son in the first hour after birth and sat beside the bed where Bagrak rested, and the child's eyes were open and moving with the unfocused wonder of new sight, and Aaron was not aware he was crying until Bagrak reached out and put her thumb against his cheekbone and said, quietly, "He looks like both of us." "He does," Aaron said. His voice was not entirely steady. "We should name him," she said. "Yes," Aaron agreed. He looked up from the baby's face to hers, tired and warm and entirely herself, the most beautiful face he had ever known. "What about Rocco?" he said carefully. "If you would want that, after your brother." Bagrak went very still. Then she looked at the baby, at his amber eyes and sage skin and dark hair, at the small fierce person that was already entirely itself, and she said, in a voice that was quiet and contained and very full, "Rocco Stone." "Yes." Aaron pressed his lips to her forehead and she closed her eyes, and their son Rocco made a sound of mild discontent at being held so still, and both of them looked down at him and Bagrak laughed, low and warm, the most beautiful sound in any room. The years that followed were built in the way homesteads are built, one season at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. The south field expanded. The barn gained a loft. A second child arrived 2 years later, a daughter, Mara, who had her mother's tusks and her father's stubbornness and her own entirely original approach to the world. And the cabin grew a second room on the east side to accommodate the family it had become. The town of Ridgefall shifted further over those years, not uniformly and not without friction, but in the way real things shift, through contact and time and the wearing away of assumption by specific experience. Bagrak was a fixture at the market, and her knowledge was genuinely useful, and the sorghum she had introduced to the district had become a reliable crop that other farmers had adopted, and these things mattered to practical frontier people in ways that abstract tolerance never quite managed. Martha Holloway had Bagrak to tea. Holt Greer's daughter asked her to look at a saddle she was repairing and took genuine notes on the technique. Old Gracia, who had settled in a small house on the Territory Road and was becoming something of a fixture herself, sat in Ridgefall's tavern on winter evenings and told stories that people pretended not to be listening to and were absolutely listening to. Jed Aldous never came around. Some people didn't. But Jed Aldous was not the whole of the world, and his disapproval was not the whole of the story. The Territorial Council, with the documentation that Bagrak and others provided, formally discontinued the War Bride program 2 years after the Stone Darkwolf testimony was submitted. The program was acknowledged, in dry official language, to have been a violation of basic civil rights. It was not enough, and it was not justice, and it was also something, and something is how change begins. Daru came back with more riders and a formal delegation when the dissolution was announced. She sat at Aaron's expanded table and ate Bagrak's cooking and looked at Rocco, who was 2 years old and already attempting to boss the barn cat around, and said to Aaron in careful comment, "My people doubted your kind of man existed." "My people doubted Bagrak existed," Aaron said. "I have been grateful every day that I was wrong." Daru looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think that is true." She reached into her coat and brought out something wrapped in dark cloth, a small carved token, worked in bone, the wolf claw pattern of the Darkwolf clan. "This is a clan friend mark," she said. "It is not given easily. It means you may call on the Darkwolf clan and be heard." She set it on the table. "You have earned it, Aaron Stone, by how you have treated what was given into your hands." Aaron picked it up carefully. He looked at it, then at Bagrak, who was watching him from across the table with those amber eyes that were still the most vivid thing he had ever seen. She had her arm around Rocco, who was falling asleep against her side, and her leather bodice was worn from good use, and her hair was braided over one shoulder with the wolf bone comb worked in above her temple, and she was entirely, absolutely herself, as she had always been. "I didn't treat what was given into my hands," Aaron said to Daru. "I treated a person the way a person ought to be treated. She did the rest herself." He looked at Bagrak. "She has always done most of it herself. I just tried not to get in the way." Bagrak made a sound of soft exasperation. "That is not what happened," she said. "It is mostly what happened," Aaron said. "It is categorically not." Rocco made a sound of sleeping protest at the disturbance, and they both stopped and looked at him, and then looked at each other, and Daru watched the two of them in the warm lamplight of the kitchen, and filed it away in her memory as something she would tell in the clan's gather hall, not as a political story or a diplomatic story, but as a human story, which was the oldest kind. On a Sunday evening in the 5th year of their marriage, Aaron and Bagrak sat on the porch in the late summer dusk and watched Rocco chase fireflies in the yard with the wild, total concentration of a 3-year-old, and baby Mara slept in the crook of Bagrak's arm, and the fields were gold and full, and the farm smelled of cut hay and warm earth and the day's last sun. Bagrak had the key on a cord around her neck. She wore it there every day, the iron key, the only one, that Aaron had pressed into her hand on a December afternoon 5 months into the story of them. She wore it as deliberately as the Darkwolf clan mark on her arm and the iron band on her finger. Aaron watched her watching Rocco in the yard and thought about the morning 5 years ago when a wagon had come up the lane and he had stood on the porch with an iron collar in his hands, looking at a woman who was expecting to be given chains, and he had set the collar down. He thought about all the things you don't know you are doing when you are doing them. The key, the cord cut, the room, the porridge he didn't ask her to cook, the Orcish words he had tried to learn because they mattered to her. The bench built to her height, the wolf carved imperfectly in the corner, the boundary walk, the fire, the blizzard, the market, the kiss in the doorway, the vows in 2 languages. The son named Rocco, the small things that were all one large thing, the decision made over and over every day to treat a person like a person until the person knew they were one, and then to keep doing it after that because it was true and because you loved her. Bagrak looked over at him, feeling his gaze. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," Aaron said. "Just looking." She studied his face. Then she said in Orcish, the word that meant home person, the word she had said in the doorway on the first kiss and that she said sometimes still, not as an endearment but as a fact, what he was, what he had always been, what she had known he was before she fully knew it herself. He said it back to her still imperfect, still slightly wrong at the end, and she corrected his pronunciation as she always did, and he tried again, and she nodded as she always did, and Rocco came barreling up the porch steps with a captured firefly cupped in his small orc green hands, urgent and luminous, and held it up to show them both. "Look," he said with the absolute certainty of a child showing you the most important thing in the world. "I see it," Aaron said. "It is beautiful," Bagrak said. Rocco opened his hands and the firefly lifted into the summer dusk and was gone, and he watched it go with wide amber eyes, and then turned back to his parents with an expression of total satisfaction, as if the whole point had been the going. Aaron put his arm around Bagrak and she leaned into him, Mara warm and sleeping between them, Rocco thundering back down the steps in pursuit of the next small light in the yard, and the summer evening spread out before them. The fields, the lane, the pines at the edge. The first star appearing above the tree line and the door of the cabin behind them was unlocked, as it always was, the key around Bagrak's neck against her heart. They had built this. Together, from a cut cord and an iron key and a decision made in a moment to be a better kind of man, and from a woman who had stood in a stranger's yard with her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes wide open, deciding whether to trust the impossible thing in front of her. She had decided yes, and every day since, they had both been right. The stars came out above the homestead one by one, the way all real and lasting things come slowly, then all at once, until the sky was full of them and the light was everywhere.